Kelsey, are you going to share screen, or do you want me to do it on this end?
Julie, if you could, that'd be great.
I can. Maybe for coming on. And yeah, so we have, this is our it's crazy to think this is our next last session with this cohort. And so just really want to take the time today to open up the space and talk on some ideas around community engagement, communication, mental, emotional health considerations. We know, and appreciate these are very heavy and weighing topics, that we've been working through. So also just hope that everyone takes care of themselves and each other as we engage through this. And just really grateful we have today with us Professor Laverne, who's on to share a presentation on healing-centered engagement, Indigenous 5Cs framework. And we have Mandi with us from Port Gamble S'Klallam to present on approaching community members about RMPE decisions. And then we should have some time at the end for some discussion together. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand this over. I will stop sharing my screen and hand this over to you, Laverne.
Good. Adeochud means hello, everyone. My name is Holeg, or Laverne Demientieff. Thanks so much for inviting me to be here. Deloy Chet, Getringa Chag Xit'an. So my family's originally from Holy Cross in Anvik, Southwest Alaska. Sadith Nakai, Rudy and Alice Demientieff Yith Haba Ajret. So my parents are Rudy and Alice Demientieff, and the late Rudy and Alice Demientieff. Sioj Sakangane Ve'ajret. My son is Sakangane, or Kyrie. Sakangane means my protector, and it also means dragonfly. And Holeak, my name means springtime. Togatili Kayachoch Yich Nacion. I actually grew up in Nenana and in Anchorage. And Kayachoch is Visto. So I live in North Pole, Fairbanks / North Pole area. UAF Trapieta Natin Kuisinich social work Boho. So I work at UAF on the Trapieta campus, which means Wild Potato Hill, and I work for the social work program. I've been with UAF since 2006, and a lot of the work that I do actually focuses around trauma and healing centered engagement. I do presentations on adverse childhood experiences as well around the state. And a lot of the research that I do really is exploring primarily with elders, but community members, how our traditional practices still are used today to support our health and wellness in this kind of fast-paced modern society that we're in, that's ever changing. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly and share my PowerPoint here. I don't think I have anything. Let's see. So the presentation I want to share with you today is called Healing-Centered Engagement and an Indigenous 5Cs Framework. And I actually put this together maybe about 4 or 5 years ago now, but have been working on it for a very long time, just thinking about, I work with students primarily in my role, right, as a social work educator. And so many of my students are going out into the world, into organizations, and also just their lives and in their communities and experiencing trauma. And also going out into these spaces where they're engaging, where there's a lot of crisis, a lot of trauma, a lot of challenges. And they're also bringing some of the trauma that they've experienced into those relationships. And so you can imagine that it gets really challenging to navigate that, right? Just to think about, sometimes you get triggered by things, or things make you, you can be in a situation where there's crisis and just be really triggered. And how do you stay in engagement? How do you stay engaged when it's hard? And do your best to do no harm, and also, to be your best self. And I think that that's a challenge for everyone these days. And I know in the work that you all do, that's also possibly what you're experiencing. So I actually started working with Melinda maybe also about 5 years ago, and Melinda Chase, and she's my cousin also. I've known her for a long time, but Melinda, we used to go on walks all the time around Fairbanks and just talk about a number of things related to climate and our work and mental health and trauma. And she was just telling me about the work around tribal climate adaptation that she was doing, and invited me to share at a training that her program was doing around trauma and mental health. And at the time, I just shared, kind of like I'm sharing now, just a little bit about my work and what how maybe it can be helpful. And it was really well received. And I realized, at that time, I was also doing work with organizations, and there's so many of our organizations and institutions that are also experiencing trauma, right? And so that have been traumatized in some way, and have a culture of trauma or crisis, or things like that. And so just recognizing how this healing-centered engagement, these practices might be helpful as we navigate the challenges, and really do our best to, again, try to stay engaged and try to support ourselves in really difficult times, support ourselves and each other. So since then, I've done a number of trainings with Melinda, and actually just went to Paula, California for their Tribal Climate and Health Adaptation Summit, and shared this work there as well. What I'm hearing is that this on mental health and climate adaptation and crisis and all of that is necessary, and people are doing it in various ways, but maybe more in depth things need to happen. So that being said, I wanted to just say I'm so open to questions or comments or things that you may want to add related to this presentation at any point in time. So whether you put that in the chat, or if you wanted to share it, just come off mute. I'm totally open to all of that. I think I only have about 25 minutes, maybe around that, something like that, half hour, I don't know. And so I usually start. So when I created this program, one of the things or this presentation, I think of it as an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to engage with groups of people doing, different types of work in a good way. One, in a good way, and two, it's an opportunity to create a community of care. It's an opportunity to create a community of practice. So oftentimes, especially with mental health and the things we know around health and things like that, we learn a lot and we know a lot, but there's a gap between what we know and what we do. And so sometimes that gap exists because we just don't have maybe we haven't just had the time to practice or learn it or do it together in a group, or for it to become really kind of like this normalized or part of our culture or part of our process. And so I'm always working in that gap there. Like, what we know is a lot. Like, we know this, we know what's good for us, we know it in our minds. People know, what's happening with climate change, but what we know and what we do are often can be different things. So working in that gap sometimes is a really important place to be, because I think it's part of the gap is where we're creating the practice, right? Creating the community of care, creating the practices. And so I always start with an activity, and elders that I've co-taught with over the years, have shared that starting in a good way is necessary for a number of reasons. One, that we're all coming with the energy of the day, right? So our lives, we're coming to meetings, we're coming to spaces, we're coming to whatever we're doing, we're coming there with our own energies. And sometimes those energies just keep us in our head in the past, or keep us in our head in the future, and we're thinking about deadlines and what we need to do next. And I think that elders have shared that, by starting in a good way, sharing story, prayer, meditation, whatever it is, right? Bringing us all to the present space. And in that way, then we can release some of that energy and get more on the same energy space. And there's a number of ways to do that. And I mentioned a few just a minute ago, but one of the ways that I wanted to do that today with you all is just to do a brief exercise and just kind of going inside. So a lot of this work is thinking about, how do we want to show up in this work, right? How do we want to experience what we're doing, and how do we want others to experience us? So as we go out and do the work, and that is a really intentional space. And so if you don't mind, I'd love to just take you through a brief visualization. And if you feel free to close your eyes. And again, this is an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to open our hearts, to engage, to just be open to the process of what's happening. So I always talk about, so I do a lot of meditations with students, and a lot of people are at different varying stages with things like meditation and things like deep breathing. I have a trauma history. I also have a resilience history. And so this is my dad right here. I grew up with my dad, who's, beautiful human being, brilliant, could build anything, build our boats and our houses, and go, do all the things he needs to do to take care of his family of 10, trap, and just a good friend to most everybody. And I always had, soup on the stove and inviting people over to eat, and good human being. And he was also an alcoholic, which created also abuse and unpredictability and some trauma in our lives. And it's, I think, growing up in this, and then, kind of having the interests that I have, I was just like so fascinated by the complexity of our humanness, right? The complexity of who we are as human beings. And probably why I'm in social work. But I wanted to just acknowledge him. He's here with us. He's passed about maybe 20 years ago now, but I just want to honor him as well. So how do we show up in this work? So often I will tell students, if you haven't taken some really deep breaths into your belly and engage that part of your body, it can sometimes feel uncomfortable or unnatural, or even maybe painful or scary. So I think that part of this process is really just kind of just being okay with wherever you're at. You can close your eyes or leave them open, but I like to start with a few deep breaths, because that engages, especially if we breathe into our belly. Sometimes as someone that has experienced trauma, and my stress can go from 0 to 20 pretty quickly, my breath can come from right here. And if you think about breathing just from your chest, from right here, It's kind of like ramps you up, right? Like kind of gets you going and makes you want to like, be ready for whatever's coming. And it's that hyper vigilant state that you can get in, but your body's then not relaxing. So you have to also practice engaging your parasympathetic, which is your rest and digest, which happens when you breathe deeply all the way into your belly. So, so when you take a deep breath in, breathe into your belly, you can feel it going up and down. And then a lot of people don't realize that the exhale is really powerful, right? I love a good exhale. So when you take a deep breath in, and then I'm going to ask you to hold at the top and then release. And when you exhale, it can be really methodical, right? Slow exhale, 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 exhale as much of that out. It's releasing toxins, releasing any stress that you might be holding on to, release anything that's not serving you on that exhale. So this is something I didn't grow up learning, and I don't think many of us did, right? That I actually have control of my intense emotions at any point in time. I did not know that growing up. I did not know how to do that. I did not know how, I wasn't taught any tools. We didn't have language around it. Something I learned as an adult. And it's something I use now often. And I use that with my students as well. So anyway, so when you take a deep breath in, you can also breathe in whatever you need. And maybe that's peace this morning. Maybe it's connection. Maybe it's some energy. Maybe it's just self-love. Whatever it is that you need this morning, you can breathe that in on the in-breath. So let's take a deep breath in together. Hold at the top and release. Long, drawn out exhale. Take a deep breath in. Hold at the top and release. And again, you can do this at your own pace. There's no right or wrong way. Take a deep breath in. Hold and release. And if you're doing this right about now, you might start feeling your shoulders fall a little bit. Maybe your face is starting to soften a tiny bit. Maybe your jaws might be starting to release a little bit. Take another deep breath in. Hold and release. Just feeling really grateful to be here, grateful for this beautiful morning with you all. Take one final deep breath in. Hold and release. So we can create the spaces by doing this. And I'm just going to ask you to kind of stay where you're at and just reflect for a second. So let's just go inside. You can feel free to close your eyes if that works for you. And let's just reflect on the work that you do. And we recognize that there's many challenges, right? It can be challenging, but let's set that aside for just a moment. So reflect on why you do the work that you do. What's the passion? What's the fire within you? The heart, the spirit of the work or for the work that drives you in this work. Let's connect to that for a second. Where does that come from? What values drive you in this work? Justice, sharing and caring, reciprocity, giving back, a deep love and respect for the earth, for people. So just take a moment and feel that in your body, in your mind and spirit. There's something there that connects you to this work. How do you want to show up to this work every day? How do you want to experience your day? With joy, confidence, love, and connection? And how do you want others to experience you in this work? Supportive, calm, loving, helpful, knowledgeable, organized. So let's just close this reflection with a little bit of gratitude. Again, feeling a sense of deep love and gratitude for yourself and all that you do and put into your work. Feel a sense of gratitude for all those you have helped and all those you will help, for the responsibility to hold space for them as they do their work. And feel a deep sense of gratitude for all the ways in which those you have helped have also taught you or inspired you and helped you to transform. And when you're ready, you just come back into the space. I wanted to just kind of acknowledge, right, by starting in a good way, doing a deep, like a little bit of a reflection, it changes the energy of the space. And I hope that brings you to more to a present place. And that's where we can engage better, right? That's when we can remember better. That's when we can learn better. That's when we can recall better. And that's where we are more engaged, just when we are in this present moment versus in our heads in the past or in our heads in the future. I'm not gonna there's a lot of slides in here, and I just wanna show you kind of what I do or what I talk about. This presentation can be 3 hours. I've actually did a week-long presentation on this, with some folks in Bethel, but, so it can be long. So I'm just gonna share a bit. So this slide is core beliefs and intentions guiding our work, and I think thinking about the intentions, kind of like we did, is super important. What are the intentions we have in the work we do? How do we want to show up? What is our intent today? What is our intent for the next week? And so, like this first one, Indigenous cultural wisdom and practices must continue to exist for another 10,000 plus years. So that's one of my intentions when I do research, when I do presentations and work, and just thinking about, engaging in understanding that. And I think about my mentor, he passed away a couple years ago, Elder Jim Dementi from Shagaluk, and he shares, I think about him. He was my language teacher and worked tirelessly to share the Dekenog language with all of us, tirelessly. And I think, and he was, in his 90s when he passed, and I think about his experience kind of carrying the language through some really difficult times, colonization, boarding schools, and all of the things that were happening, and protecting the language, and then teaching it and sharing it for the rest of his life. Right, that is. So someone like me in 2023 can actually use that language for my benefit, for my health, for my identity, for my wellness. I think that's so amazing. I'm so honored and grateful to him, and then that instills a responsibility within me to continue to carry that forward. So that's just thinking about intention. So it's a good way to start any work that we do. But when we think, like, what gets in the way of showing up as whole, right? Authentic, joyful, calm, creative, or collaborative. And that's where, the challenges we face, right? The toxic stress and the unresolved trauma impact our ability to be in relationship, right? Which is essential for collective decision making, for teamwork, and for healing. It also adds to disconnection. It creates barriers, it creates limitations, decreases creativity, and decreases collaboration. So, you know, I think stress. So if you've ever had an ACEs training, adverse childhood experiences, you know that ACEs or trauma is prevalent in our society, right? It exists in large, wide scales. At some point in our lives, as human beings, we're going to experience that. And depending on our support systems and what we have available to us internally and externally, that trauma might stay with us in some ways, right? And kind of show up in various ways throughout our life. And so for myself, for example, I have been working on my healing since my early 20s, and it always shifts. Like I feel sometimes I feel like something is resolved, and then, you know, I get to a different stage in my life and it shows up in a different way. Um, and I continue to do the work. I'm always doing the work, and that's okay. That part of it is that practice of wellness, right? Just the practice of doing it. But I think the other part to this is the stress that we are often inundated with, right? So the stress from our organizations, um, from media, from just the world and the things that are happening, really do impact us and can keep us, can get in the way of us showing up as whole, authentic, joyful, calm, creative, collaborative individuals. And what happens, you know, when it gets in the way, right? I think that I'm not going to have time to get into the science of stress and trauma in the brain, but it's really, really helpful to know. So I just would encourage you, if you have not attended an adverse childhood experiences training, that you do, right? It helps us to understand how trauma and stress impact our bodies, and our health throughout our lives. But not only that, it also helps us understand then how we connect with each other, and how we engage with each other. And so I introduced a few concepts, parasympathetic, right? Which is the rest and digest, right? And so we have the ability to calm ourselves. And then our body also is very um, wise, right? And knows when we need to protect ourselves. And so our body works to keep us alive all the time in multiple ways. It's really fascinating. And so we have that sympathetic nervous system, which causes us to kind of ramp up so that we can do what we need to do to stay alive. So fight, flee, whatever it is. But when we're in that sympathetic space, right, that when we're ramped up, when we're ready to go, sometimes our frontal cortex, our thinking brain, can go offline. So you see the hand model of the brain here. The frontal cortex is kind of like your fingers, and it's like flipping your lid, right? So when we are in that, when we're ramped up, when we feel unsafe, when we feel triggered, when we feel attacked, and that can be anything sometimes, right? It can vary from you raised your voice to you stood too close to me, to something triggered me with a smell, right? And immediately it goes to your amygdala, which is like our smoke alarm that sets off alarms, and our prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking and rational brain, kind of goes offline. We flip our lid. And then we're being driven by our emotional brain, by that reactionary brain, right? And the reactionary brain helps us in so many ways, and it's so important. But you know, if it's being constantly triggered and we're staying in reactionary mode, then it's hard to be in relationship with people, because we're constantly fearful, we're constantly anxious, we're constantly looking for signs of danger. It makes it harder to remember, harder to recall, harder to think. And one of the things that I've realized as someone who has experienced trauma is that sometimes this goes off a lot, and I have to, for one, be aware that it just went off and I'm in this state, and then use my tools, which has taken me a very long time to practice, and which is why these days I'm like, okay, let's do this together. Let's practice this together. Let's make this a culture of care versus just me doing this myself, right? And so, but deep breathing then begins to bring my frontal cortex back online, where I can become more present and more engaged in our relationship. So, and there's a lot to this, and so I'm not going to have time to go through it, but again, this is such a great, it's so important when we understand it, we have compassion for ourselves and for others. We have more compassion. We understand what's happening. We take things less personally. We have just a more, you know, we have a better ability to stay in those moments when things get hard, instead of disconnecting and pulling away, or fighting, or wanting to do all of that, right? And why is this important to climate change work with communities? Because the hard decisions are having to be made, right? We have to have conversations that bring up a lot of things that could trigger us and put us in that space of flipping our lid. But when we're in that, it's hard to be creative, right? It's hard to be think about strengths and the possibilities, because we need to get back into that space of safety again. And there's just a lot, right? We understand and I know you guys know all of this again, right? But the eco-anxiety, the grief, the solastalgia, fear of climate change, and we experience these things in our body, which is so fascinating. So even understanding something like somatic response to fear or worry or grief, right, shows up many times as muscle tension, as digestive issues, as chronic pain, as respiratory problems, as trouble sleeping, anger. It shows up as irritability, right? All of that expresses itself oftentimes in our bodies. And so, really part of this process, part of learning this, is getting connected to that. What's happening when I get triggered, and I want to disconnect from the world, and also I feel like I want to throw up, or I have a huge stomach ache, or I just want to go to sleep, or I just want to disassociate and and not be here. And so there's so many things that we do, that our body does, to protect us in this way, but that doesn't always help us when we're trying to get our work done. So learning about it, understanding it, and understanding how that might be happening for someone else gives us a lot of ability to be more compassionate and stay in the present and stay engaged. I'm not going to get into trauma-informed care, but basically it's really it's also I refer to it more as healing-centered care, but it's really recognizing that trauma exists, and it has impacted us in a number of ways, in our bodies, in our minds, and in our spirits. And it's recognizing how trauma affects all of us, and then responding differently, right? Because when we know it, when we know what happens in our bodies, minds, and spirits with trauma and stress, then we're going to do things differently, right? We make different decisions. We take things, we don't take things as personally. Maybe we understand someone's experience better, right? We have more compassion, which means we act differently. And that's what trauma-informed care is. How do we act differently when we know that trauma and stress experience how people engage and behave? And so thinking about how do we stay engaged when things get challenging or overwhelming? And so I just wanted to share that, there's so many strategies. And in this particular presentation, I talk about the 5 C's, and I also talk about cultural practices. So we have so many beautiful cultural ceremonies and traditions and practices and knowledge that bring us back into this place of safety and in connection, and in that collective that we can utilize today. So that's kind of what this is about, and it's learning these skills. And so I know that, let's see, I'm just going to take a quick peek. It's 9:41. So the 5 C's, for example, are compassion, connection, community, curiosity, and ceremony. And these are things that over time I've talked with elders and community members, and these things have risen to the top for me about how to engage in a good way. And just one example from each. Compassion. So my uncle came to me a while back because I work in academia at the university and in an institution. And he said, when we work in these big organizations and institutions, sometimes we can really stay in our head. Like we can just be walking around in our head a lot, right? Thinking about the deadlines we have and the paper we need to write and the next meeting we need to go to and what needs to get done and all of the things. And when we're in that space, we are missing sometimes the connection to the rest of our body. We're missing the fact that our body is telling us it's tired, or maybe it needs water or needs a bio break. Like we tend to stay in this space. And so he said, I want you to practice every day, moving from your head to your heart, moving from my head into my heart space. I have to tell you, it's the best advice I had ever been given. I'm so grateful to my uncle for this because it adds to my ability to engage with colleagues, to engage with students, to stay engaged when things get difficult. Because when we're in our heart space, right, we are inhabiting more of our bodies, right? And we are coming from a place of compassion for ourselves and compassion for others. And we're able to stay in the present more often. A lot about compassion I could share, but I don't have time today. But I would imagine that, if you guys had conversations about the impact of compassion, so much would come up. And I just want to share, I guess I'll share one more thing. Compassion is catchy. It's actually good for our health and it's catchy, right? So when we show up as compassionate beings, other people in the room tend to catch that, and they show up as compassionate beings. So just something to think about. Connection. Whenever I talk about connection, I think it's important to think about how stress and trauma, or even just any challenge that we're faced with, depression, anxiety, addiction, all of that create disconnection. And it creates disconnection because if you can imagine feeling really anxious or feeling really depressed, it's hard to be in connection. It's hard to feel like you want to engage and be around people and in that space, right? In that state of being. So we disengage, and sometimes the people around us disengage as well because they don't know. It's not that they don't love us, but they don't know what to do either. And it's hard for them, and they don't know maybe what to say or how to be or how to help. And so people disengage. There's lots of disconnection that happens amongst challenge in the world, in our lives. And so part of our work is then to think about how we create connection, right? And it starts with us. It always starts with us, right? So when we think about all of this stuff, healing-centered engagement practices, it begins with us, not the other, not someone else, but it begins with us. We have to be able to first connect back up to our own bodies, to our spirits, to culture, to nature, before we can, and we have to, work and practice loving ourselves. All of that then flows out to everyone else more naturally. So connection is really important, and our elders, connection is just built into our Indigenous worldview, is understanding in our language, thinking about, Yachgitsi is in our language is the name for raven, right? My grandfather, and Gera, right? Older brother is the name for the brown bear. And so just thinking about how we are connected, and in our language, it tells us very clearly how we're connected to the rest of the world. So it's built in. Our elders also think so much about community, and they yearn for it. And when you hear them talk, they love thinking back to the times that we engaged as a community. They recall times we went eeling together, or go berry picking as families, or go, do things as communities, because they know the power of community for survival and for healing and for health. So we have lots of communities, but part of our job, I think, is to create communities of care as well. So things like this, having these conversations in these spaces, is so important. And then not only that, but community of practice. Let's practice this stuff together so we're not feeling so alone, or like, you know what, if someone doesn't know, like, oh, I just, breath work or meditation doesn't really work for me. But when I do it in a group and when we have conversations about it, maybe it feels better, it's more helpful. And then curiosity again, our elders were, our people were always curious, right? And curious being just like we listened, we observed, right? So that's no different today with stress and trauma, right? Being curious about what's happening in our body, right? Being aware of when we are triggered, understanding what our reactions, our protective mechanisms are. And so my protective mechanism has sometimes been disconnecting and being silent. And I realized, as I create that, or would go into silence, that it was really painful for the people around me to experience my silence in that way. So silence being very loud. And so I had to really work on that. So being curious about these things and learning about it. I remember talking with my family, because I have lots of siblings, and we would talk about our trauma past, right? And I would start shaking, and I would hold on to it so tight because I was like, why am I shaking? There's something wrong with me. I'm so embarrassed. I'm ashamed, right? And I didn't tell anybody, and whenever we'd process, I'd shake. But as I've learned about trauma, what I understand is that much of that stress gets stored in our nervous system. And like animals, we shake it, our nervous system wants to shake and release that, right? The stuckness of the energy of that trauma. And I didn't know that. But had I known that, then I wouldn't be blaming myself, thinking that something was the matter with me, thinking, I'm so ashamed, or why does this happen to me? Like, what's wrong with me? All of those things. When we have these conversations, we can realize, like, oh, okay, that's actually something that happens when we're releasing some of that trauma. Not, and it might happen in different ways for different people, but having these conversations help, making them more accessible. And then the last one is just ceremony, right? This is powerful, right? Ceremony is what brings us back into balance. And so an elder said, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for ceremony, talking about Indigenous people, because ceremony is what we do when things get rough. And not just when things get rough, we also have, ceremony for positive things too. But thinking about what ceremony does, it gets us grounded, connected to spirit and to nature, to each other, brings us through a process of moving forward, right? Just bringing us to the present, connecting us to knowledge, but in helping us to kind of regain balance. So there's all kinds of ways that looks in Indigenous societies and across the world, with many cultures. And so learning about that and incorporating that into your work and into your daily life and practice. So I'm not going to go too much into this. I think I would just say the last part of this presentation that I think is really important, and I did mention it, but it's really thinking about the fact that examples of resilience and wellness are rooted in all cultures and communities across the world. And so learning about them, and if we have them, using them and bringing them back, or thinking about how do we do this today, right? And so many of our ceremonies connect us to each other, build new relationships. They're about helping to be responsible for each other, right? Sharing and caring. So much is built in. And if we think of our Western healthcare system, or our Western mental health system, so much of that is external to us. We have to go outside and seek that somewhere, right? But we have things like these practices, traditional practices and ceremonies that are often built into our societies and built from our values. And so those are things that are built into our everyday lives. It's not anything we have to do external. So we really want to also learn and acknowledge and bring back some of the things that have our values built into it already, and already exist in our context, in our culture, and our understanding of the world. So again, Dokuten, I just want to maybe just end, by sharing that there's a really good book by Eduardo Duran called Healing the Soul Wound. And in it, he talks about telling his clients that they're in a really powerful place. And, of course, they don't feel powerful. They feel like, he's a therapist. So they're coming, they're coming to him because they are in crisis or dealing with a lot. And so they don't feel powerful. So they ask him, what do you mean? And he says, well, when you made that decision, even in your thoughts, when you took that first step, when you picked up the phone, when you came into this office, when you got on the bus, right? All of those things set in motion ripples, right? Ripples of wellness that have already begun to heal the people around you. They actually are healing your ancestors already, and they're healing future generations. That's a really powerful place. So the power of even that intention, right, of our own healing and wellness, or healing and wellness together, is really powerful. So I'll leave you with that. Dokuten. I know that's a lot, and I hope that was helpful in your work and thinking about how to engage and stay engaged. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. And I don't know if there's any questions or thoughts or comments.
But it's just huge thanks, Laverne, when you shared that you've done this for a week long training. I was just drooling at the thought of getting to be in that space with you for a week. Does anyone have any questions or reflections that you'd like to share? Either go ahead and do so, or if you're having any sound connection issues at all, you can always put in the chat as well.
I always get silence, and I'm not sure what to take that as. If people are just like, gosh, that was too much, or it was a lot, like I just need to reflect. I'm just thinking. Or yeah, I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if it's helpful.
You're getting not too
Thanks,
much,
Sydney.
just enough. I can only speak for myself, but I'm going to venture a guess that it's a lot more in being in that reflective space.
Okay, Dan. Thanks, Karen. Lots of processing, yes. Thanks, Neva. Thanks, Karen.
Well, I'm grateful that you and Melinda started taking those walks together.
Yes, amazing conversations.
Well, let's give huge thanks to Laverne for sharing with us. And I think, of what you're providing to is so powerful at just so many intimate levels, from the personal to the family to the community, which I think where a lot of that processing requires, of because you're thinking about it in all these different factors of your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And this is, in your work, I've been doing this with organizations as they navigate, difficult things with boards. Yeah, there's every space I think that we're in can benefit from understanding how we engage and how to better engage with each other when things get difficult. So
Like the world could use a lot more of that.
yeah, absolutely, Sydney. I'll send the PowerPoint. I'll send it probably as a PDF, but yeah. Thanks for asking.
Great. Thank you, Laverne.
Yeah, all right. Should I just go ahead and log off?
Yeah. I mean, you're welcome to
Okay.
stay if you have the time. I know you're also a very busy person in your own right. So we
No
really,
worries.
really appreciate
Yeah.
you being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Laverne.
Yeah.